He was born in Birmingham, Alabama, in 1919, and his family moved north to Chicago when he was still small enough that the city became the only home he would ever fully know. Chicago in the 20s and 30s was not a simple place for a black child. It was a city of possibility and a city of walls, often in the same block, often in the same sentence. It was a city that had drawn hundreds of thousands of black families up from the south along the rails of the Great Migration, promising factory wages and northern air, delivering something more complicated than either. Timuel Black grew up inside that complication. He grew up knowing exactly what kind of country he lived in. He attended DuSable High School on the south side, an entirely black school, one that in spite of its segregation, or perhaps because of it, had gathered some of the finest teachers the city's neglected hiring pipeline would allow into one building. They taught him to read history carefully. They taught him to take the news seriously. And in 1939, sitting in a friend's living room, listening to jazz on the radio, he heard the bulletin about Poland. He was 17 years old. He turned to his friends and told them, "It won't be long before we're in that war." They weren't as sure. He was. His awareness had arrived ahead of his age. He had worked for a Polish Jewish family who had gone back to Europe and returned changed, quiet in ways that required explanation, speaking about ghettos and camps and a reorganization of cruelty that most Americans would not begin to comprehend for years. He had listened. He had filed it away in the part of the mind that tracks things which matter. December 7th, 1941 was his 21st birthday. He was celebrating when the news came through. A close friend, full of patriotic energy, raised a glass and proposed a toast: Christmas in Berlin and Easter in Tokyo. That friend enlisted almost immediately. Black was drafted in 1943. In the months following the race riots that had torn through Chicago and Detroit, cities where black and white war workers had been poured together into housing projects never designed to contain that kind of pressure, where the explosion had been building for years before it finally arrived. His father's response to the draft notice was not pride. His father told him plainly, "What the hell are you going to fight in Europe for? The fight is here." He was, by his son's description, a militant kind of man, someone who would have gone to Detroit himself if the roads and trains had not been deliberately blocked in the riot's aftermath, checkpoints erected to prevent black men from moving freely across a country they were about to be asked to die for. The irony was not lost on either of them. Black reported for induction at Camp Custer in Michigan, then transferred to Camp Lee in Virginia. The army he entered was not an army organized around merit. It was an army organized around race, a bureaucratic reflection of the country that had built it, with all the country's assumptions about who was capable of what, encoded into its assignment procedures, its promotion policies, its physical layout. All officers in the units he served were white. The Army General Classification Test, the AGCT, was administered to determine who was qualified for advancement, for officer candidate school, for leadership. Black soldiers who scored above the threshold and applied to OCS were given one attempt. White officers were sometimes permitted 2 or 3. The non-commissioned officers with access to the records allowed their men to know their scores. Black soldiers who had outperformed their white superiors on the examinations were expected to take orders from those men regardless. This was not a secret. Both sides of that arrangement knew the numbers. The tension that created was not incidental. It was structural. It was daily. Most black GIs, regardless of their test scores, were assigned to the Quartermaster Corps. Timuel Black was. The Quartermaster Corps moved supplies, food, clothing, ammunition, equipment, the logistical bloodstream of an army in the field. It was essential, unglamorous, and it placed black soldiers in the role of stevedores and laborers within a military that was actively fighting a war against a racial ideology it preferred not to examine too closely in its own mirror. The situation had additional layers. Black soldiers who had grown up in northern cities, Chicago, Detroit, New York, often arrived with more formal education than the black men from the rural South who had been made non-commissioned officers over them. The Army had in some units given supervisory roles to men it calculated would be less likely to challenge white authority, Southern black men who had lived longer inside a specific geography of compliance, who had refined the art of survival within strict boundaries. The result was a resentment that ran in multiple directions simultaneously. Northern black soldiers who considered themselves more educated chafing under men they saw as less qualified, Southern black soldiers who recognized the condescension and responded to it, white officers above all of them calibrating the arrangement to maintain their own position. This was the army that would cross the English Channel and land in France. They shipped out across the Atlantic in the manner all black soldiers shipped out, in separate quarters, separate mess halls, the ship itself a miniature reproduction of the country they had left. The Atlantic crossing was made in zigzag patterns to evade German submarines, which did not distinguish between races of men when selecting targets. They arrived in Wales and waited. In Wales, the segregation continued its work. Black soldiers were assigned to different towns from white soldiers. The ordinary British population encountered this for the first time and did not always understand it. White American soldiers circulated stories about their black counterparts, that they had tails, that they howled at night, the medieval vocabulary of American racism transplanted into English pubs and high streets. British civilians, who had their own complicated relationship with the people of their colonies, nevertheless often found themselves siding with the black Americans in conflicts, drawn perhaps to the obvious absurdity of what they were witnessing. Young black soldiers who refused to be restricted to the inferior towns assigned to them were disciplined. Young black men who formed relationships with British women were vulnerable to accusations that required no evidence to be acted upon. A number of black soldiers were hanged in England before the invasion. One of them was from Black's own unit. They were fighting a war before they got to the war. That was how he described it, years later. Simply, without bitterness as performance, just as a statement of arithmetic. The invasion of Normandy was planned for June 1944. Black's unit was originally scheduled to land on D-Day itself. They were pulled from the initial wave and replaced by another quartermaster group. The men around him were disappointed. He was not. 2 days later, they landed at Utah Beach. Utah Beach was not Omaha. The casualty rates at Utah were substantially lower, a difference produced by weather, current, navigation, the specific geometry of fortification and shoreline. But Utah was not safe. It was not quiet. It was a beach in France, being contested by two armies, with everything that entailed. What he remembered, going in, young men weeping for their mothers, men who had lost control of their bodies from fear, men making jokes, most of them simply quiet, sitting inside the specific gravity of what was coming. He remembered thinking, if I get through this, nothing like this will happen to me again. And then the ramp went down, and there was the water, and the sound of the large guns, and France was in front of him. The quartermaster troops at Normandy were not spectators. The Germans knew that logistics were the spine of an invasion. Break the supply chain, and the combat units dissolve into stranded men without ammunition, food, or medicine. The ammunition dumps the black troops were managing were primary targets. German aircraft strafed the supply convoys at night. Black rode through multiple Luftwaffe strafing runs on 6x6 trucks, anti-aircraft fire and tracer rounds splitting the dark above him. Men in his unit were killed. There was a particular security problem the army solved in an unexpected way. The Germans had inserted saboteurs, young men who had grown up in American cities, who spoke American English, who knew baseball teams and radio programs, and the names of local politicians, who could stand in a crowd of American soldiers and be indistinguishable. The only reliable way to identify potential infiltrators was skin color. So the army took white American soldiers off the streets after dark and replaced them with black soldiers doing patrol duty. If there was a white person on the street at night, the orders were to detain or shoot. Black Americans were given guns and authority in the darkness that they were not permitted in daylight. The entire unit was eventually decorated with the Croix de Guerre. The moral geometry of this arrangement was not lost on him. He held it carefully. After Normandy came the drive east. Brittany, then toward Paris. They arrived in the capital on a day he could not fully prepare to describe afterward, a day of crowds and noise and women throwing flowers, and the specific quality of collective joy that belongs only to people who have been under occupation and have just seen the last German car leave their street. The French had buried things during the occupation. hidden things the Germans would have destroyed or confiscated. Among what they had buried were jazz records, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Coleman Hawkins, the music of Black America preserved underground in France, while the musicians who made it had faced a different set of pressures in the country of their birth. He stood on the Champs-Élysées while the FFI, the French resistance fighters, were still chasing the last German snipers through the side streets, while the guns were still going off somewhere around the corner, and the French people were paying tribute, not specifically to Americans, he thought, not to any army as such, but to the idea, the abstraction of freedom that the army represented to people who had spent 4 years without it. He had been part of the machinery of that liberation. He seriously considered not going home. Belgium came next. The Battle of the Bulge extended from late November into January, a massive German counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, an attempt to split the Allied lines and reach Antwerp, which many historians have described as Hitler's last significant gamble on the Western Front. For those living inside it, it was a siege of cold and artillery and uncertainty that lasted from Thanksgiving to Christmas of 1944. The mail stopped reaching them. The supply lines were under pressure. He wrote home in a state that he would later describe plainly as psychological disintegration, convinced that his family had abandoned him, that no word was coming and none would come, that he was going to die in Belgium unknown. His mother eventually reached him through the Red Cross. Move. The letter came through. He was still alive. During that period, he worked alongside German prisoners of war, using them to move supplies. Some were simply men doing what they were told. Others were not. One refused a direct order from Black because, in the prisoner's calculation, a black man's authority was not real authority. Black put the bale of supplies on the man's back at the top of a staircase and applied his boot. The German went down the stairs and the bale followed. Black was reprimanded for mistreating a prisoner. The prisoner's refusal to obey a lawful order from a superior lawful regardless of that superior's race was not addressed. He held that one carefully too. He was living, he said later, in a state of permanent tension between pressures from multiple directions. Some of his black brothers worried that he was drawing attention to the unit, making things harder by insisting on rights they had all learned to rote around. The officers above him resented the insistence. He was in the middle of a category that had no comfortable position in the social architecture of the United States Army. He used a single word for it: lonely. Then spring came, and the German lines collapsed, and they moved east into Germany itself, and the smell reached them before anything else did. Buchenwald was liberated by American forces in April 1945. When Black's unit came to the camp or something like it, he would later express some uncertainty about which specific camp he had entered, in the way that men sometimes hold uncertainty about the worst things they have seen as a buffer against their full weight. The smell was the first fact. Everyone knew what it was. You did not have to be told. The human body in death has a specific quality, and in sufficient quantity it fills the air before the eye can confirm it. He said. He became more passionately angry than he had ever been in his life. He wanted to kill every German, every single one. Anyone who would do this to people was not worth the continuation of their existence. He said it plainly, without apology and without performance, as a statement of what he had felt in that moment, standing in the stench. And then he said, on reflection, he knew that not all Germans had done this. But the other question remained. How could they have let it happen? How does a civilization produce this and then live alongside it? It was the clincher. That was his word. God, it was the clincher. Because what he saw in that camp was not simply an atrocity committed against European Jews, though it was that. It was the demonstration of what ideology can do when it removes the basic category of human from a group of people and then provides machinery for acting on that removal. He had lived inside a gentler version of that machinery his entire life. The country he would return to had built hospitals and schools and water fountains and bus seats and voting booths on the same foundational premise that there were categories of human being for whom the full protections of civilization did not apply. If it could happen here, it could happen there. That was the logic. The direction ran both ways. VE Day came in May 1945. He was in Marseille, being processed for the invasion of Japan. when he read in Stars and Stripes about a weapon that had destroyed an entire Japanese city. The soldiers around him were elated. He was not. He lay down on his bunk and stared at the ceiling and asked himself what this meant. Not tactically, not strategically, in the longer sense. What kind of world had just been built while he was watching? When the Pacific War ended in August and the ships turned home, he stood below decks as they came up the Hudson River. Above him, the white soldiers were crowding the railings, looking at the Statue of Liberty, making the sounds men make when they see their country again after years away. He stayed below. He had decided he would not go up. He had thought about this. He had reasons. Then he found himself crying. He went up. He stood at the railing and he said the same things the other soldiers were saying, felt the same pull toward the silhouette of the woman with the torch, the same confused and complicated gladness at the sight of home. He could not suppress his loyalty, he said, even with everything he had seen, everything he had been made to absorb, the disproportion and the indignity, and the loneliness, and the dead men, and the smell of Buchenwald. He could not push the loyalty back. It was there anyway. Irregular, as he said, capable of being better, as he also said, but his. He went home to Chicago. He became a school teacher, then a historian, one of the city's most enduring voices on the subject of race and memory, and what American cities owe the people they have used. He marched in 1963 on the train to Washington with hundreds of thousands of others who had also decided the country was capable of being better. He compared it, that day on the train, to another march, the one down the Champs-Élysées, the guns still firing in the side streets, the French people paying tribute not to armies but to the idea. He had been part of both marches. He understood what he was doing in each one. He lived past 100 years old. He had known since he was 17 what was coming. He had gone anyway. He came back carrying everything he had seen, and he put it to use.